So today I'm going to be porting my 400cc two-stroke Polaris. This works for all of the 400cc Polaris two-stroke ATVs. I'll mention my specs in the video, so if you keep watching, you get to hear those. And that being said, let's get into it. So, if you don't know anything about two-stroke porting, I would recommend that you spend a long time reading up on it before you even attempt to do anything like this, because there's a very delicate balance you need to maintain between your intake, which is down here. If you can, yep, there we go, you can see it. So that's where you suck air in, and then as the cylinder comes down, it's pushed through your transfers right there and right there. And then back here, the big port, that's your exhaust port. And really, the most important thing on your porting, as far as like characteristics go, is your exhaust duration. So that's the amount of time that your exhaust is open. So these Polaris cylinders, because they're attached to a CVT, they come with a lot of exhaust duration. So that means that your exhaust port is open for a long time, which that moves your power band higher in the power range. So these ones have about 186 degrees of exhaust duration, which is pretty aggressive. And if you're just doing like a trail port, there's no need to mess with the exhaust port at all. The power comes from widening the exhaust. So a good rule of thumb is around 70-ish% is about the maximum you want to go. And that's because if you go too wide, your piston ring can catch on the roof of this port right here. So you gotta be really careful on that. And whenever you're porting, millimeters matter. So it is very precise work. You need to be very confident in what you're doing before you approach it. I've actually been reading on two-stroke porting for like over a year now. And I mean some really in-depth stuff, and I still feel like I could probably be more prepared, but I'm gonna take a crack at it. So I would really try and understand the mechanics of it and the balances you need to maintain before you even attempt this. So I'm gonna widen this exhaust up to 72% bore diameter. So that is gonna be quite a bit more aggressive than it currently is, but it's still gonna have a good bottom end, so it's not super lazy down low and very peaky. And I'm not even gonna touch the top of the exhaust port, because any more duration and I'm gonna have a very peaky and narrow power band. Also, another important note, another reason you probably don't wanna touch the top of the cylinder. So the actual shape of your exhaust port is very important. So see how it's nice and rounded up there? That's so your piston rings don't catch. And so if your port's too wide and it's got too flat of a top, your piston ring is gonna push out while the exhaust port's open, and it's gonna ride in there and it's gonna catch that lip and it's gonna snap and break, and catastrophic failure and bad stuff. But if you go a little bit wider and you keep that nice round top of your port, if it does bulge out, this round shape will slowly push it back in as it's coming up, and it won't catch. So you can be a little bit more aggressive if you have a nice round top on there. So that's something you want to keep in mind. And what I can't stress this enough, millimeters matter. You probably don't even want to get near the top of the exhaust port with your carbide burr, because you can really mess stuff up very quickly and you'll have to buy a new cylinder, which is not cheap. And as far as our transfers go, on this port job, so that's the transfers right there, just a little reminder. I am not gonna touch those at all. One, because I can't afford a 90-degree rotary tool, because they're like a couple $100 and I'm broke. And also because for all intents and purposes, for just like a mild port, you don't really need to mess with them. And then back here above our intake port, just so you know, those are boost ports, and they point up towards the spark plug to help clean out some of that exhaust gas from the cylinder. And then here's another view. So these are our intake ports right here. So the piston comes up past this on the compression stroke. It's sucking in air through here and filling up the crankcase with your fuel mixture. And as the piston comes down, it forces it up through these, the transfer ducts, and it creates positive pressure in the crankcase, and it forces that air into the cylinder, which is part of the reason why 2 strokes are so powerful, aside from there being twice as many power strokes. But anyways, so all I'm gonna do in the transfer ducts, so this is another area where you really could mess stuff up. I'm gonna smooth these out, take out these lips. You can probably see it better down there. Clean up all this garbage, smooth things out. And then here's another good tip for you. All of these edges, like these 2, you do not wanna make those sharp. You actually want them to be round and smooth. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, but it actually will flow more if you leave them smooth than if you knife edge them. So you don't want to mess that up. And also knife edges will crack because they're very skinny. And then down here, these are our Boysen ports. They also suck in air during the compression stroke, and just a little bit more air into the bottom end. And I think that about covers it. I might have mentioned I'm going to add just a little bit more down here. I'm going to take just a little bit more off so we have just a tiny bit more time that we're actually able to suck air in. And also on these, you want to make sure that these are very nice and tapered and round, because you don't want the edge of your piston catching right here, because it's going to be a catastrophic failure situation. And I think that about covers the basics. And it can get very, very wild when you start messing with port timings, and that would probably require its own video to talk about, because there's some very delicate balances you need to maintain there. But so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna take some Dykem Blue, which I'll grab my bottle real fast and show you. So this is Dykem Blue, and basically it's just a dye that goes on there. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna paint this onto the cylinder, and then I'm gonna scribe with a pick what my ports are gonna look like, and that way I'll have like a good outline basically of where I need to cut to. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna scribe my lines in, and I will pick back up with you guys then. So if you look right there, you can see my marks on where I'm dropping the intake down to. And then the exhaust, there you go. You can kind of see where I'm going with the exhaust port. So just a couple mils wider, and should be good. And then I'm also gonna clean up the intake and the transfer, or the Boysen ports, I mean. And then I'll clean up the transfers too, and hopefully we'll be making a whole lot more power. All right, so this is kind of an important note. So these are the 4 bits I'm gonna be using on my rotary tool. So on the left here, we have my carbide burr. So I'm gonna use that for all of my shaping and like my big cuts. So like I'll use that to shape the exhaust port and take off a lot of material quickly. And then after I'm done shaping things, I'm gonna switch over to my grinding stone here, and that's gonna start to smooth out all the marks from the carbide burr. And on the intake side, we're gonna stop here, and you can go, put it in a sandblaster after you do that to get a more uniform texture, but it's kind of not worth it if you're just doing this as an amateur like me. And but on the exhaust, I'm gonna keep going after I do my grinding stone. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna sand it with 80 grit and then 120 grit to smooth it out. And then after that, I'm gonna switch over to this cotton buffing pad. I'm gonna put compound on it and polish the exhaust port. So those should be the only 4 tools you need, unless you wanna get crazy and get a sandblaster. All right, well, I'm gonna get to cutting this thing, and I'll catch back up with you guys once I have my rough cuts done. So all I'm doing right here is slowly taking away material. I'm grinding for a couple of seconds, then I stop, double check things, and then especially when I'm actually working on the width of the exhaust port, I'm taking it very, very slow. I'm doing like maybe 5 seconds max, stopping, checking my lines, and then, you know, keep going. And so I'll probably let this play out for about 30 more seconds, and then if you want to skip that, I'll show you the results of my rough cuts. Alright, there's the rough end on our exhaust. So now I'm gonna go back and sand it. Here, let's see if I can show you the port. Alright, this lighting's terrible, but it is bigger. So I'm gonna go ahead and sand down the little marks. So at this point, I was actually just using the blue grinding stone, and I switched over to my sanding discs, and then I polished. So at this point, you're not really focused on removing material. You're just trying to get it as smooth as possible and getting that nice polished finish. Okay, well, we skipped a few steps because my camera shut off. But as you can see, our exhaust is very shiny in there. And then if you take a look, it's looking pretty good. So all I did was, after I got done with the burr, I sanded it with 120 grit, and then I hit it with a cotton pad and some polish. But boy, did that take forever. So I'm gonna start working on the transfers and intake, and then I'll catch back up with you when I'm done with those. All right, so I've been working on the intake side, and mostly what I'm doing is just roughing up the surfaces for better fuel atomization, and I cleaned up the Boysen ports some, and now I'm gonna work on smoothing out all those bumps on the actual intake. So I'm gonna get back to work on that, and then here's the transfers. Looking pretty good. So I'm gonna keep working on that, and then I will catch back up with you once I've smoothed up the intake. I've got my flash on so you guys can see here. This is the final product. So I've got our Boysen ports nice and rounded off. Got rid of all the edges. And then as you can see, our actual port divider here, it's nice and round and smooth. You do not want to get that thing too narrow or it's going to crack. So there's our actual intake. And then flipping it over, you see our transfers here. As you'll notice here, our two dividers are slightly different sizes, and that's because there's a pretty substantial difference in the amount of metal on each one. And I didn't want to risk hitting a coolant jacket, so I played it pretty conservative and just shaped them up as best I could and tried to get them matching. And then it's all roughed up in there to help with fuel atomization. And then if you really wanted a uniform finish, you could put this thing in the sand blaster and it would look, you know, very professional. So that way, whenever somebody like me posts pictures on the Facebook forum, you can go under there and, you know, make a post, you know, subtly comparing yourself to me, which I guess if you know, you know. And anyways, that's about all I did on the transfers there. Just smoothed them out, got rid of all the lips, especially like right there where the transition from the sleeve to the actual aluminum casting is. There's normally a lip right there. So flipping it over to the exhaust, spin it around. So you can see, got it nice and polished up, very smooth. Our little decompression port. So that's all smoothed out. And then I'll show you the actual port itself. Flipping it over again. Got it nice and uniform in shape. I took things very slow on that because that made me very nervous cutting that out. But I think it turned out well. So I suppose that's the final product. I'll show you some before and afters, starting with the intake. I think that porting job is going to perform pretty well. It's not the craziest port job because I wanted to maintain relatively good drivability. I didn't want to be too peaky. And you guys know my exhaust specs already. I'll put my intake height in the description so that way you guys can copy that as well. But with that being said, don't let somebody who's selling a service tell you that you can't do this, because you can. I mean, they'll tell you as many horror stories as you're willing to listen to try and convince you not to do it, because they make money off of you being unwilling to try it. All right? If you're willing to read the basics and understand how the changes you're making affect performance, there's no reason why you can't do this. So if you're somebody who has more experience than me, I would love to hear your feedback. And if you're not, I'd love to hear your feedback too. But I need to send this thing off to get it bored so that we can actually test this out and see how it performs. And I guess that's really it. If you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. I greatly appreciate it. And I hope to see you next time.